Something about really early SpongeBob has always been interesting to me. Sure, seasons 2 through 4 may be more polished outings, but the first season's willingness to do some really creative things with its animation and storytelling, while still having to establish these iconic characters, has always been a fascination to me. There's definitely a beauty in the show not having to live up to the standards of being the gigantic media franchise that it turns out to be, and the experimentation that allows. And as you can probably guess, there's no episode that I believe showcases this as well as Season 1, Episode 15A, Sleepy Time. So, as this episode turns 23 years old next Tuesday, I think it's a great time to look back at this quarter hour and see how it mashes up characterization and experimentation to create a now iconic episode.
Where am I? Is that me? Or is this me?
We open to a pretty classic looking scene with SpongeBob and Gary about to head to bed. We get some adorable early show SpongeBob and Gary, but with a quick Ween reference.
Mind your wandering eye, you little mollusk.
The mollusk lingers with its wandering eye.
We're already into the first stream. This lack of any meaningful setup isn't really seen at all in the later seasons of the show, but as it does in this episode, it gives some really meaningful extra time to what ends up being a pretty lengthy plot. SpongeBob's dream takes place in a world filled with items from the Krusty Krab, as well as some jellyfishing nets. It's backed by this fantastically groovy track, which in conjunction to the art style shifting to be more abstract, creates a completely different setting than almost anything else in the show. Meeting this abstract style is the actual premise of the first part of the dream, SpongeBob having to reassemble his body. The show does this gag all the time, but it feels really good here, as they immediately emphasize the fittingly dreamlike nature of the entire episode. SpongeBob then begins to drive a race car, which, besides just giving us a tour of the terrific backgrounds that make up this dream world, also sets up the driving license gag in the episode. The bit with SpongeBob overly observing his license and getting into an accident, only for Mrs. Puff to take it, is funny and all, but what's really impressive is the massive amount of characterization in this scene alone. In like a minute of footage tops, we get references to his job, his jellyfishing, his struggle to get a license, all of that on top of what's already a uniquely animated and funny scene. And that's the theme of the episode. In super short rapid-fire dreams, the show manages to fit in some of the most iconic settings in the series, some stupid funny gags, and some obscenely great characterization. After getting launched out of his own dream, SpongeBob learns of his ability to traverse dreams and quickly makes his way into Gary's. Now, I'll be honest, because of the humorous route that Gary's dream takes, there's not much characterization, which is unfortunate. Or at least it would be unfortunate if the scene wasn't still terrific despite this. Gary's depiction as a humanoid keeper of this massive, stunningly animated library is one of the most memorable things of the first season, and the literary references and lines spoken by Gary being juxtaposed against the giddy SpongeBob just kills. The ending with Gary telling SpongeBob a limerick sets up a callback for later, and his warning to SpongeBob to mind his wandering eye completes a callback to the Ween reference from the beginning of the episode. In general, this scene does a really good job pandering to both its younger audience as haha snail man funny, but still manages to have jokes meant for an older viewer. This scene is funnier if you know who Emily Dickinson or John Steinbeck is, or if you know what a peripherin is. Either way, there's no viewer who watches the scene and doesn't get amused by any of the jokes, as just like all of early SpongeBob, it's incredibly comedically diverse. The next scene, backed by some of the carnivaliest carnival music ever made, has what is likely the most iconic image from Sleepy Time, being Patrick on the seahorse ride. Despite being initially stylistically simple, the episode chooses to use this void-like area in order to insert some really impressive stuff in the form of SpongeBob transformations, especially when you remember this was the last episode produced with traditional animation cells. The writing in this one does some really interesting stuff too, with a focus on the character trait of Patrick other than his stupidity. Patrick being able to enjoy a dream where he just sits on a kiddie ride in a void is hilarious, not because Patrick is dumb, but instead because of the simplicity in it. It's rather atmospheric to watch as he peacefully rides, especially in juxtaposition to the chaotic dreams that we're about to get into. So much of Patrick's existence in the show was in order to just be the less intelligent SpongeBob, so seeing his dream be based on his lack of energy rather than his lack of intelligence is nice to see, especially since it creates such a stylistic scene. There's a reason this is a thumbnail of the video, as without any fancy animation or backgrounds, the show's able to create a scene that's remained recognizable for over 20 years since its release. Patrick drops his last quarter into a gutter, and another setup for a callback, as SpongeBob goes into Squidward's dream in order to wrap up his neighbors. The plot for this one is Wolfgang Amadeus Tentacles giving a performance for the king, which is just fantastic. SpongeBob's ability to seemingly teleport throughout the concert hall just adds to the hilarity of the whole thing, as the show switches to take place largely from Squidward's perspective, as the viewer is just as surprised by where he shows up as Squidward is. We get the conclusion of the Peruvian Dreamer Limerick gag from before, as Squidward breaks his clarinet, only to realize that he's going to have to begrudgingly play SpongeBob in an innuendo of a scene that I hopefully don't have to explain to you. Even without looking at that side of the gag though, just everybody crying at how beautiful they find the screams of SpongeBob in this reality is so predictable and dumb that you can't help but laugh at it. Squidward getting outshined by SpongeBob is a tale as old as the show, but given that this was only 15 episodes into the series, it's impossible to hold it against it. While this dream might be the least visually interesting of them all, there's no way to say that it's not on the same level as the rest of them, as its comedically perfect plot and execution are just too funny to ignore. Squidward squirming in anger gives us the first sign that SpongeBob is actively messing with people as we travel across Bikini Bottom to get to Sandy's tree dome. The setting of this one is flying through the sky after dropping from a plane, as we get the rare look at the non-ocean world. The show does a really good job of making the environment seem otherworldly, as it looks entirely different from the show's usual ocean backgrounds. Because of the stream's length being one of the shortest of the episode, the exchange between SpongeBob and Sandy only lasts a couple of lines. Yet still, they quickly settle on the parachute gag, do it twice, and then have it end satisfyingly with Sandy uttering paramedic once she's hit the clam manure truck. It's nothing grand or deep, but it gets the job done. Just as Squidward's dream revolves around his desire to be a respected clarinetist, this dream revolves around Sandy liking extreme sports while not directly shoving that in your face. The episode does a really good job in making it so that even though we're 5 dreams in at this point and still have multiple dreams left, it doesn't feel stale. As between the rapid gags and interesting backgrounds and settings, you really don't have time to be bored before SpongeBob hits the ground and falls out of the dream. After what is probably the most predictable gag in the episode,
No more messing with people's dreams.
we get to the least developed dream of the episode, Pearls. No real plot here, and the entire dream is really just a setup for a gag for the first few moments, where the audience and SpongeBob are led to believe that it's Mr. Krabs' dream. But despite this, the show doesn't hold back at all, still designing what a Pearl dream world would look like, filled with different items associated with her throughout the show. Even the scenario that's occurring, Pearl having a tea party with her stuffed animals, is a joke about how Pearl is generally seen as pretty lonely throughout the series. For a scene that's less than 30 seconds, the episode designs an entire environment for a transition gag to occur, and then doesn't cut any corners while doing so. The next dream is a Moby Dick parody with Mr. Krabs chasing down a Moby Dollar. This parody could work as an entire episode, complete with yet another atmosphere completely different to that of the show's norm, and yet instead, it's a minute-long segment of this episode. The jokes throughout this one are as solid as anything else in Sleepy Time, from the dollar blowing out coins, to Mr. Krab referring to his wallet as a money net, to SpongeBob trying to chase down said money net, falling, and the pun with SpongeBob being fired in both a physical and physical sense. There's just no second of this episode that's wasted. Krabs' love of money being shown in this kind of light isn't new for the show, and is done various times after this episode, but for a plotline that they had to introduce, play out, and conclude in 45 seconds, it's ridiculously creative and fun to watch. This kind of dream doesn't work if the relationship between SpongeBob and his boss wasn't already established, but because it is, it ends up having to waste no time creating any kind of dynamic between them, and instead being able to immediately go into the dynamic scenes that make up the dream. The final dream in this episode is perhaps the most robust of them all, Plankton's. Taking place in this fiery version of Bikini Bottom, we get to see Plankton's hatred for his small physical and metaphorical stature personified, with him hilariously stomping out the citizens of the city. This dream is as dreamlike as any of the ones before, as it truly feels like an apocalyptic version of Bikini Bottom without having to actually establish any other plot besides Plankton being big and being able to shoot lasers out of his eyes. Besides the ending of this one being about the series-long trend of Plankton getting crushed underneath people's feet, it also references this episode starting with SpongeBob and Gary, as he has to save Gary from Plankton, using the transformation ability that has been set up in almost all of these dreams, completing its use in the episode and the climax of the whole thing. Plankton's dream is really the final coup de grace of this episode's attempts to be like nothing the series ever did before or after. We get to see Plankton waking up after this dream, showing that SpongeBob has done more damage in this one than any of the ones before, and setting up the final scene of the episode after SpongeBob gets home. The final scene of this episode sets itself up to be a dream, as SpongeBob is haunted by the heads of those whose dreams he invaded. This could have just been the end of the episode, but it decides to go the extra mile as everybody from the main cast confronts SpongeBob for his actions throughout the episode. Seeing every character in one place is pretty novel for this episode's place in the series, and SpongeBob's punishment for everything he said in this episode, just being getting yelled at, feels appropriate without being over the top. And finally, Patrick asking for a quarter, while admittedly an example of a Patrick is dumb joke that I abhorred earlier, is still funny and ends the episode before it ever even has the chance to lose even a bit of steam. In only 11 minutes, SpongeBob SquarePants' first 21st century outing delivers immensely fantastic characterization and atmospheric environments over and over and over again, without any real stumbles or ever even having a moment of feeling stale. Every main character of the show is in this one, and they all get their own moment to shine as SpongeBob travels to different dreamscapes. The stylized animation of this one is in its own class, and while I promise the point of this video wasn't to trash on modern SpongeBob, you're never going to find an episode like this after the first movie, as no show could produce such an experimental classic under the pressure of being the largest cartoon on the planet. The early seasons of SpongeBob are the first episodes of anything I can remember from growing up, and I hold them very close to my heart, so I'm very glad to be able to finally take a look at one of my favorites from that era to start off the year's worth of videos. If you have anything you want me to cover this year, you can let me know in the comments or find me on whatever is left of Twitter. Either way, this has been AmpleSamuel, and I'll see you in the next video in a fortnight and a half. Thanks for watching.